Hi everyone, welcome back. This is part 3, Tutankhamun, the Boy Pharaoh documentary. He just died. Spoiler, I don't want to ruin anything. If those of you who are like, I hope he's still alive today, I got some terrible news for you. But he died by a broken leg. So anyways, they're talking about, or they just finished, if you haven't seen part 2, you should, because I'm doing a terrible job. They're talking about him being buried next to his 2 stillborn children. I'm not going to get any further. You can go back and watch it. You'll learn a lot more. I'm just filling you in at the end. And video.
Intended for burial in Tutankhamun's tomb were the mummified remains of his 2 stillborn daughters in tiny coffins.
I apologize. I did go back, I don't know, 15 seconds or whatever from the end of the second video. And here we go.
Although work had started on a tomb for Tutankhamun, it was by no means ready. As Maya and other officials inspected the Valley of the Kings near Thebes for an alternative tomb, they decided to use the one being prepared for Ai, the late king's chief advisor and distant relative. The undecorated tomb was not yet suitable for Tutankhamun, and the craftsmen were ordered to excavate a new chamber that would become the king's burial chamber, together with a small room beyond it known as the treasury. The 2 existing rooms in the tomb would later be known as the antechamber and the annex. After excavating the burial chamber, the royal craftsmen painted the walls, transferring existing designs from papyrus prepared during the Amarna period. In accordance with the traditions of the time, Tutankhamun had the mortuary temple built for him in the Theban necropolis, where priests would make offerings to keep his spirit alive in the afterlife. The late king's body was taken nearby to be embalmed, preserving his body as a vessel into which his soul could return to rest. His brain and internal organs were removed, including his heart, which was typically left inside the body. Traditionally, the internal organs would have been placed in canopic jars, but Tutankhamun's were placed in a chest divided into 4 compartments protected by the goddesses Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket. The king's body was covered with natron, a salt used in the mummification process to dry out the body and stop it from decaying. After 40 days, the natron was removed and the body was wrapped in linen bandages, interspersed with amulets and other pieces of jewelry, while 2 daggers were placed on his body. The king's hands were crossed in front of...
Why are the daggers on the body? In case he's got to fight his way into the afterworld? Or is it just a sign of respect? Anyone know?
...of his body, holding his crook and flail. On Tutankhamun's head, the embalmers placed Akhenaten's skull cap and the royal diadem between layers of bandages, all covered by the golden death mask, the final and most spectacular item on the mummy. Early the next year, the Hittite envoy was able to return to Suppiluliuma's capital of Hattusa, in what is now central Turkey, alongside an Egyptian envoy bearing a letter from Ankhesenamun. The queen was outraged that the Hittite king had not believed her and repeated her offer once again. Suppiluliuma continued to have his suspicions, but was persuaded by both his own envoy and the Egyptian messenger that the offer from the Egyptian queen was genuine.
You got to understand, that's probably a very, very odd ask from her to the king. To the Hittite? No. Am I saying it wrong? To that leader. He's got to believe, I don't trust this.
He duly dispatched his 4th son, Prince Zananza, to travel to Egypt to marry Queen Ankhesenamun and become the new pharaoh. When Zananza died en route to Egypt in unclear circumstances, his father accused the Egyptians of murdering him. Upon the death of her prospective husband, Ankhesenamun decided she had no choice other than to marry the elderly Ai, her grand uncle, who became the new king. In his correspondence with his Hittite counterpart, King Ai acknowledged that Zananza was dead but denied any wrongdoing. Suppiluliuma responded by launching an invasion of Egyptian territories in the Levant, only for the captured Egyptian prisoners to bring the plague, which had been troubling Egypt for many years, to Hattusa, a disease outbreak which killed the Hittite king. With Ai in place as Tutankhamun's successor, the late king's funeral was scheduled for the end of March, 7 months after his death, much later than was typical. On the north wall of the burial chamber, the artists hurriedly painted the figure.
7 months, didn't they say he had to be buried? He had to name a successor and be buried in 70 days? That was in the last video, I believe. 40 days he was getting the salt bath and all that stuff, which, you know, you can still do 2 things at once, but I wonder how much time was taken up with trying to get that Hittite. Why do I feel like I'm butchering the name? But anyways, 70 days, it took 7 months. So wait a minute. Seven 70 days is 10 weeks. 7 months is 28 weeks. Damn. Damn. Wow. Okay, that was a bit longer.
Of Ai performing the opening of the mouth ritual on his predecessor's body, a ceremonial act symbolizing rebirth in the afterlife. This ceremony was typically led by the crown prince, strengthening Ai's tenuous claims to Tutankhamun's throne. There was no time to build a wall separating the burial chamber from the antechamber, so only 3 walls were decorated for the time being. The scenes from Tutankhamun's burial ritual had already been painted on the walls of his burial chamber before the ceremony had taken place. The king's mummified body was presented with food and drink before being placed on a sled and dragged across the sands up the slopes of the Valley of the Kings into the tomb that had been prepared for him. Before the body entered the tomb, Ai performed the opening of the mouth ceremony by gently touching Tutankhamun's lips with an adze, allowing him to speak in the afterlife. With his mummy carried by priests, the late king entered the darkness of his tomb and was placed into 3 nested coffins inside a red sarcophagus. The innermost coffin was made of solid gold, while the outer 2 were made of wood and decorated with glass and jewels. After the lids were placed on each of the 3 nested coffins, they were sealed with resin, but the heavy granite lid of the sarcophagus cracked and had to be repaired. The workmen then discovered the lid could not close properly, as the feet of the outer coffin were too tall and had to be filed down before the sarcophagus could be sealed tight. The workers then put together the wooden panels forming the 4 shrines that covered the king's body.
They were really not expecting any of this, and they were in a rush to get all of this done. And they were just piecing things together, which, he's 19 years old. I don't know if I said this in the last video, but he's a cat. You're not exactly ready for something unexpected. Newsflash, you're not ready for something unexpected. What a dummy I am.
But in their haste, assembled the shrine the wrong way round, swapping east and west and north and south. In the meantime, Tutankhamun's canopic chest was placed in a shrine on the east wall of the treasury, with a box containing the remains of Tutankhamun's stillborn daughters placed nearby. At the entrance to the treasury, a shrine containing items used in the king's mummification was guarded by a jackal representing the god Anubis, the god of funerary rites. After the funeral, the artisans built the 4th wall of the burial chamber, decorating it with a scene of Tutankhamun in the afterlife, in the traditional artistic style. After their work was done, the entrance to the tomb was blocked, covered with plaster and stamped with official seals. Several months later than anticipated, Tutankhamun could begin his journey to the afterlife, where he would be engaged in a daily cosmic battle alongside the gods against the forces of evil that threatened to disrupt the earthly world. Yet the late king's continued existence in the afterlife could only be guaranteed if the priests at his mortuary temple continued to utter his name, and if his tomb and body were to remain undisturbed. After King Ai assumed the throne, Tutankhamun's prospects for an afterlife seemed bleak. Although he had married Ankhesenamun to legitimize his authority as pharaoh, Ai quickly elevated his existing wife, Te, as his great royal wife. Ankhesenamun was not featured in any of his royal inscriptions and disappears from the historical record.
So she was in such a rush that she asked the uncle to marry her. The uncle's like, "You betcha." Then he slides in and basically pushes her aside and brings his wife in. I thought the guy wasn't married. I wonder if she just didn't care. I mean, like, she gets pushed out. She probably just didn't care anymore. She was 19, 20 as well at the time. Somewhere around there. No, she was younger. I don't remember. But still, she probably didn't care.
As far as Tutankhamun's spirit was concerned, worse was to follow, when his tomb was broken into twice within the space of a year. The thieves may have been artisans who had worked on the tomb and knew the layout, and they carried out various small precious items that could not be traced back to the tomb. While the authorities made some attempt to tidy up the ransacked tomb, not everything returned to its original place, and the tomb was simply resealed. Within a year of Tutankhamun's burial, a heavy rainstorm broke out over the Valley of Kings and deposited a meter of rubble over the entrance of the tomb, ensuring that the tomb of Tutankhamun would remain undisturbed for over 3,000 years. After reigning for around 4 years, the elderly King Ai died. His designated successor, General Nakhtmin, who may have been his son, died shortly before him. Since Ankhesenamun was either already dead or in any case out of the picture, the succession was claimed by Horemheb, the highest-ranking courtier. As Tutankhamun had been buried in Ai's intended tomb, Ai chose to take over the tomb in the western Valley of the Kings, originally intended for Tutankhamun but not finished before his death. Unlike Ai, Horemheb had no royal blood whatsoever, though his great royal wife, Mutnejmet, may have been Ai's daughter. While he continued his military campaigns against the Nubians and the Hittites, the new king considered it his primary duty to restore political order at home. While Horemheb continued Tutankhamun and Ai's work to restore the old religion, he decided to erase the memory of his immediate predecessors, replacing their names on temples and monuments with his own. By doing so, he not only consigned their names to oblivion in the mortal world, but extinguished their spirits in the afterlife. Not only did Horemheb order the desecration of Ai's tomb and the possible destruction of his mummy, he also usurped his predecessor's mortuary temple. He took credit for Tutankhamun and Ai's construction projects at the temples of Luxor and Karnak. All over the country, Horemheb replaced Tutankhamun's imagery with his own. He would undoubtedly have done the same thing to Tutankhamun's tomb, but it was more difficult to access after being buried under rubble. As Horemheb had no surviving children of his own, he named as his successor a senior official named Paramesu. After a reign of around 14 years, Horemheb died and his successor assumed the throne as Ramesses I, the founder of a new 19th dynasty. The second and
Ramesses, isn't that the one that thought he was the god, or thought he was a god? Am I thinking right?
Third pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, Seti I and Ramesses II, the latter of whom is more widely known as Ramesses the Great, were warrior kings who helped to restore much of the prestige lost in the aftermath of the Amarna period. Horemheb's efforts to erase the memory of this period had been so successful that over time memory of King Tutankhamun faded away. In the mid-12th century BC, around 200 years after Tutankhamun's burial, the men working on the tomb of Ramesses VI built their huts directly above the rubble that covered the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. Over the course of the following 3 millennia, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Saladin, and Napoleon Bonaparte all conquered Egypt without ever hearing of the existence of the pharaoh named Tutankhamun. It seemed that memory of his reign had been almost entirely lost to history. When Napoleon Bonaparte led his expedition to Egypt in 1798, he was accompanied not only by his officers and men, but also by a large team of scientists to study the artistic legacy of the ancient Egyptians.
I'm doing this video because I did the Napoleon video, Napoleon in Egypt. And because of that, whenever I think of Egypt, I see the pyramids, the first thing I think of is King Tut, or Tutankhamun. I don't know why, it's just the first name that comes to me. So because of that, that's why I'm doing this video.
Egyptian artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone, were brought back to Europe for further examination. In the 1820s, Jean-François Champollion successfully deciphered the hieroglyphic script of the ancient Egyptians using the Rosetta Stone. This initiated the modern study of ancient Egypt, or Egyptology as it is known. Over the course of the 19th century, Egypt fell under the influence of British and French officials. The European interest in Egypt was partly economic, motivated by a desire to link the Mediterranean and the Red Sea by the Suez Canal. But interest in Egyptian heritage also played a part. Although officially part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt was effectively ruled by the British from 1882 onwards. Wealthy aristocrats and businessmen from Europe and the United States flocked to Egypt and applied to the Egyptian Antiquities Service for permits to carry out excavations. These wealthy individuals financed the archaeological digs and hired Egyptologists to carry out the work, laying claim to a share of the finds. By the end of the 19th century, archaeological activity was underway at sites throughout Egypt which would have been familiar to Tutankhamun, his father's capital of Akhetaten, the ancient capital Memphis, the monumental religious buildings at Thebes, the mortuary temples and tombs of the Theban necropolis, and, most importantly, the Valley of the Kings. The concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings was considered the most prestigious among the archaeologists working in Egypt, who all aspired to be the first to discover an intact royal tomb, as most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been plundered by grave robbers either in antiquity or in more recent times. Between 1905 and 1914, the concession was held by American businessman Theodore Davis. In February 1905, the intact tomb of Yuya and Thuya, the parents of Queen Tia, and accordingly the great-grandparents of Tutankhamun, had been discovered intact by James Quibell, a British Egyptologist sponsored by Davis. By this point, Tutankhamun's name was known to the archaeologists working in Egypt, as his name appeared on the inscriptions of tombs of officials.
When did his name appear for... Okay, so technically it disappeared for about 3,000 years, because the rubble buried it over, and then he had all his... I'm closing my eyes trying to remember everything. He had everything basically erased because of... Was it Hirman? I don't remember his name now. By Garbage Man. So about 3,000 years he was forgotten. Is the finding of his grandparents when people learned of his name again? And around what year are we talking? You know, I don't need... It was around May of 1917. Like, I don't need exact details, but if anyone knows about when the talk of him came about.
But otherwise,
not the talk of him, the remembering. yeah, there was this, blah, blah, blah.
Life and reign remained a mystery. Over the course of a decade, Davis had financed the discovery of more than 10 further tombs in the Valley of the Kings, including a small chamber containing gold foil depicting a king on a chariot bearing the names of Tutankhamun, Ankhesenamun, and Ai, which Davis identified as the tomb of Tutankhamun. By 1914, Davis gave up his concession and declared that the entire valley had been exhausted. Between 1905 and 1908, Davis had been assisted by Howard Carter, a British archaeologist who had previously worked as an inspector for the Antiquities Service before his resignation in the summer of 1905, several months after an incident involving Egyptian guards and French tourists caused him to be reassigned. By 1909, following the recommendation of Gaston Maspero, the director of the Antiquities Service, Carter began his collaboration with George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who began to visit Egypt every year to help his recovery from a car accident. When Davis gave up his concession for the Valley of the Kings, Carter and Carnarvon believed that there were more discoveries to be made in the area and successfully obtained permission to dig.
I'm going to go ahead and stop it there, and we'll come back and we will finish it. So they've just gotten concession, and they're going to start digging again the Valley of the Kings. So, oh yeah, I forgot to start this. There's a thanks button on the channel. You can donate. You don't have to. All donations are appreciated. You can subscribe, click the bell, and if you don't want to do any of that, just give me a thumbs up. All right? Hope you enjoyed it. This is part 3. I will be back for part 4. My nose itches. All right, that's not a lie. It's just my nose was itching. And until part 4 comes out, have a good day, have a good night.